Greetings around the world. My name is Tom Banshoff. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And I'm delighted on behalf of our center community to welcome you all to this online dialogue on the topic after September 11th, the next 20 years. 10 days ago now, as many of you know, we had an online forum here at the center, an opportunity for many of our scholars to share their reflections, their personal reflections about September 11th, but also their thoughts about the significance of the anniversary, what we've learned for the United States and for the world, and for our work at the center at the intersection of religion, peace, and world affairs. Today, we thought we'd do something a little bit different under the impact of the anniversary, the moving commemorations, all of the input that we've read, the outpouring of commentary in the global media. We thought we'd take this opportunity to look forward to the next 20 years and engage in conversation with one another and with you all around the world about the challenges that lie ahead. Specifically, we want to think a little bit about the themes that have been so central to the work of the center, the role of religion in our communities, local, national, and global, and the intersection of religion, peace, and violence. Now, before I turn it over to my colleague, Paul Eli, who will be organizing the conversation, I thought I'd share a few thoughts of my own. You know, it's a current dark global moment. In so many ways, we're still suffering through the pandemic. We see the crisis of democracy, the rise of autocracy around the world, the long-term threat, not so long-term it seems, of climate change, the victory of the Taliban in Afghanistan. It's easy to be quite pessimistic at this global moment, but I do see some cause for hope as we look forward, especially as you think about the religious dimension of world affairs. I think one of the remarkable long-term impacts of September 11th has been the mobilization of religious communities around global issues, not just violence and issues of peace, but broader global agendas such as health, the environment, and climate change, migration. I think, for example, of Pope Francis and his mobilization, together with other religious leaders around COVID-19, for example, the migration issue, and of course, broader issues of climate change and the environment that have been so central to his papacy. Now, we know, of course, that these religious efforts, let's be realistic, these religious efforts, these efforts of interfaith initiatives to engage have not had such a tremendous impact. In fact, it's been quite marginal. The voices are often not heard, impact very circumscribed. They often face tremendous opposition within religions themselves. We'll come back to some of these themes, I think, in the conversation. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that overall there has been a tremendous mobilization, unprecedented mobilization of religious communities for the global common good since September 11th, and how best to connect those efforts, how to magnify them, will, I think, be one of the main challenges of the next 20 years. It's a challenge that the Berkeley Center, through our research, teaching, and convening, will continue to pursue in partnership with many others around the world, including some of you on this call today. So thanks so much for joining us for this dialogue. I'd like now to turn things over to my colleague, Paul Eli, well-known author, critic, a senior fellow in the center, who will be leading the conversation with four of our colleagues, Jose Casanova, Jocelyn Cesari, Drew Christensen, and Catherine Marshall. So again, welcome, and with that, over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks also to Michael Kessler, the Managing Director of the Berkeley Center, and to Ruth Gopin, who helped organize this event. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to be in conversation with four of our Berkeley Center colleagues at one time, because this is a conversation that we've had inter alia over meals in the hallways, passing on the way to class, intermittently for much of the last 20 years. So this chance to consolidate our thought and point it forward to the next 20 years is something that I personally have looked forward to doing and that I'm going to learn a lot from. I know that. I think as I organized this event, I was very aware of the way the 20th anniversary, to me, had the unfortunate effect of canonizing some simple ideas or ideas that aren't necessarily supported by reality about the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and what followed. The one that came to mind for me most obviously was this idea of extraordinary unity that followed the attacks in the United States. I remember that time as intellectually and culturally fraught and full of division, and hope that that doesn't get scanted as we look forward. So then to read the four of your reflections on 9/11 written shortly before the anniversary was really refreshing, because it was a reminder of the complexity of thought that the four of you and others at the center have brought to bear on this event and its consequences over 20 years in rich and complex ways. I got a great deal out of those reflections, and those are found on the Berkeley Center website under the Berkeley Forum. But I'll draw, I wouldn't say substantially, but your reflections on that day are going to be the starting point for our discussion today. And I'd like to start with Jose Casanova. Now, Jose, you had written a book called Public Religions in the Modern World. And as you tell it in your reflection on 9/11, your central point in that book about the need to attend to the role of public religions in the modern world was suddenly current, was taken up, but in ways that you say for the wrong reasons. Can you explain just how that happened? And then I want to follow up with the question how it might be done differently in the next 20 years.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Paul, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here to have this conversation. Yes, on the one hand, it confirmed the thesis of public religions in the modern world, namely that the religion was becoming deprivatized, that is going public. But now was public not anymore only at the nation state level, but at the global level. This was the real impact of September 11, that somehow a group, a non-governmental organization that was somehow in the name of religion, was able to carry violence on a global basis, on a global level. And of course, this means that those secular institutions that had basically assumed that the religion is a relatively irrelevant private affair that was taken for granted, suddenly rediscovered the power of the sacred. The power of the sacred, but now I say for the wrong reasons, because it is the sacred able to precisely produce violence. And now it was out of this fear and anxiety about religion that many of the responses basically took the shape. And so I was very much happy. Obviously, it confirmed my thesis, and it probably opened a lot of venues for my career. And I became involved in the formation of many centers like the Berkeley Center throughout the world. But usually it was out of this anxiety and fear. And I was trying to say, well, there is something else that the religions can provide. And it is basically something that transcends, if you wish, the structures that we have, and allow us to think beyond the present, beyond the things we take for granted. The great transformation of the great religions was the ability to develop fraternization beyond the kinship system, that they could really bring bridges and encounters between peoples that were not simply taken as members of kinship structures. Now, the kinship structure does not disappear, but now it's able to bring trans-kinship structures of solidarity, of encounter. And my point is that in this age of globalization, in which most of our challenges begin to be global, both the global structure of governance of the capitalist system and the global structure of governments of the nation state, it has very difficulties. It has difficulties addressing the common good, precisely those global challenges, in a way that really could be helpful for the development of a more solidarious humanity. And this is the moment which religions today, and they have shown in the last 20 years, that they have this ability to transcend the kinship state. Precisely the civilizational level is not only the class of civilizations, precisely points to the ability of religion to transcend this class. And so it is in the respect that I hope that in the last 20 years, as we have to rethink our system of global governance to precisely address the global challenges that Tom Banchoff has mentioned, that religions could become a factor in the structuring of a global civil society that adds to the global governance that we have now in terms of the system of nation states and the global capitalist system.
So, Jose, you end by suggesting some of the things that religion can do and is already doing. But let's turn back to the way religion is apprehended. From indifference or diminishing of religion that led you to write Public Religions in the Modern World, to suddenly a fear of religion or anxiety about religion. So what would, if we had to characterize the apprehension of religion going forward, either descriptively or prescriptively, how should civil society apprehend religion for the next 20 years?
Well, it should apprehend, it's not a question of how civil society should apprehend religion, but how religious groups, individuals which are motivated by religion, are able to gain the courage to form structures of solidarity, social movements, non-governmental organizations that precisely transcend those national structures that we've seen is the near response to even the global health pandemic, was the reinforcement of national borders. That religious movements, religious groups, religious institutions show this ability. We don't know whether it will be possible, but I hope, because for me, not only in terms of my own convictions, but in terms of sociologically looking at global history, religions have played throughout global history precisely this role.
So when you talk about the role that religions would play in the reshaping of global governance, you mean, just as a for example, the fact that, say, the Catholic Church is transnational, and when Pope Francis speaks about the need for people to take the vaccine, that's a message that goes to many countries which have different national approaches to the issue.
Well, this is a very small example, and indeed it was for me surprising to see that among the different groups in the US, Catholics appear as the highest group. I mean, you have different categories but the last statistics I saw, 75% the highest groups which are for vaccines. But this is not only about vaccines, it's about immigration, it's about refugees, and it's about actually, and I hope that my fellow my colleague Catherine will raise these issues of gender, which are the most, if you wish, contentious issues today, in which religion is so implicated, that this is a crucial issue that will only be resolved if there is also a transformation within religious institutions in a new direction. So again, I hope, but I am ambivalent about it in the sense that I'm not sure that this will happen.
Thank you, Jose. So, Catherine, when Jose pointed that question in your direction, let's back up a bit. So, in the years when Jose was thinking as a social scientist about public religions in the modern world, you had experience on the ground of the presence of religion to a greater degree than people in the developed world perhaps recognized through your work with the World Bank and in your scholarship. Is that accurate? And if so, then did that apprehension or perception of the role of religion markedly change after 9/11, the way the perception of Jose's work suddenly changed?
The events of 9/11 were a sharp divide in the way that people thought about the role of religion in many aspects of global affairs, and that includes the field of development, which is really what my career has been focused on. It is over the last 20 years that the question that's always before me is, what's religion got to do with any specific problem? And does it matter? And if so, how does it matter? And what does that translate into practice? So one of the topics that I have seen over my professional career tremendous change is an understanding the importance of the roles of gender relations, of relations specifically between men and women. And there has been clearly a revolution intellectually as well as socially in understanding women's roles. That I think was indeed accentuated by the negative focus on religion during the crisis following 9/11. The perception came to be that one of the major reasons why women's equality was so difficult was because of religious teachings, religious practices in many parts of the world. In many ways, though, it is more complicated than that, as we've discussed on different occasions. And I think Jose, Jocelyn, Tom are well aware of the deep complexity. But maybe I can just take three issues that are of central importance for development thinkers, where they see often tepid, if not even negative roles of the religious communities with much too sweeping a brush. The first one is the girls' education, with so much research demonstrating that some of the most fundamental social, economic, political changes come with girls going to school. That's why there's so much focus on that in Afghanistan right now. But it's been a major revolution, and religious leaders have often been willing to go along with it, but perhaps without much enthusiasm. The second one is domestic violence and the realization that this is not an issue of someone else. It's a central issue common to all cultures and societies, but where it's been tremendously difficult to get religious actors to take that on as a central issue for reasons that sometimes are hard to understand, that it's seen as interfering with the family in some way. And then the third issue is child marriage, where there are 12 million girls a year who are married below the age of 18 with many diverse negative consequences. And once again, because religious leaders actually perform marriages in so many settings, one would have expected that the research and the evidence, the powerful evidence on that, would have pointed to activism, enthusiastic advocacy for doing away with child marriage. And we have seen some support in places, but not what I would have expected. So I think what that points to is one of our perennial comments about the roles of religion in public affairs, which is that it's complicated. It's diverse, it's often ambivalent, it moves quite slowly. You have points of prophetic voice and of leadership, but you also have this tepid response sometimes and even hesitation.
As far as it's complicated, amen to that. I think all of us at the center, one of the things that we have in common is this sense that these things are quite complicated and that it's really necessary to push back against oversimplification and the way simplified ideas get into circulation and move very fast. Certainly that was my experience of what happened after the World Trade Center was destroyed. Suddenly, the awareness of the extent to which religion permeates societies globally, the variety of religious expression, the outsized role of religion in things like education and in something like domestic violence in the way that you suggest, that goes far beyond a kind of God is dead campus thesis from the 60s and makes you realize that even if you think God is dead on campus, God is alive for tens of millions of people in many countries, and it goes right down into their lives. Do you think that over 20 years, did you just almost on a simple journalistic level, did you see the presence of religion growing more intense or less intense, or just kind of carrying along the way it had been over the 20 years since 2001 from the area in which you work?
I think we're talking both about perceptions and about practice. In terms of perception, it's very clear that there's a much more interest in the roles of religion that, unfortunately, as Jose was suggesting, focused on its role in inciting violence and divisions more than on the hoped for prophetic voice of that you were referring to, of common interest and common concern. We've also, though, seen really almost an explosion of interest, institutional, academic, personal, of many leaders. And when I say that my focus is on what's religion got to do with energy supply, with climate, with girls' education, et cetera, the answer is often, that's very interesting. That's something I had not really thought about. It was because what we had dealt with before was, I would say, a willful blindness, an absence of religious materials, even in libraries, that it was simply not on the curriculum, even of a university like Georgetown in its international development programs and conflict resolution. So I think that barrier is behind us, but we're still groping for meaningful ways of what we call strategic religious engagement that really looks both at the diversity of religious contributions and their dynamism, as well as simply taking them out from the shadows.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back to you with a question of what that kind of religious engagement would look like, say, in 2041, another 20 years from now. But something that you said reminded me of a distinction that is set out very clearly in Jocelyn's reflection, Jocelyn Cesare, about the anniversary published on the Berkeley Forum. Jocelyn, you distinguished between the role of religious teaching and the role of religious belonging, and suggested that insufficient awareness of the way these things are related is one of the things that led to a lot of misperceptions about religion after 9/11. Have I characterized your point accurately? And if so, can you expand on it a bit?
Yes, thank you, Paul. The piece I wrote was really to show a discrepancy in the sense that the scholarship in the last 20 years has made a deliberate effort to debunk the clash of civilization. And you have now data that shows that there is no real clashes between civilizations, that the most intense conflicts happen within civilizations. And the scholars of politics would now look at religion. Nobody would say that it doesn't matter. But there are a few issues that remain. The first one is that I think the clash is still very much alive empirically among people, because it is very easy to mobilize, to make sense of the environment in which we live. You know, when you are attacked in the West in the name of Islam, people indeed read it as a clash of civilization, noting also that the actors themselves read it this way. I always cite this anecdote, but Huntington at the end of his life was pretty much taken aback when he learned that Al-Qaeda was a big fan of his book. the leaders of Al-Qaeda were a big fan of his book. So, you know, that it goes both ways. So it's very much empirically alive, despite the fact that as scholars and as data show, it's not really validated. So the gap has to be addressed at some point. But beyond that, even if we don't believe in the clash of civilization and we think it's wrong, there are still a few flaws that we all share. The first one is really to look at Islam, to understand the role of religion in international politics. And I think it does have a lot of biases with it, including like the fact that maybe Islam is the only religion that has a sense internationally. if we don't do more comparison, and that's what the Berkeley Center is a unique place in this sense, if we don't look across other religious tradition, it remains a big issue. The second is indeed the fact that we are interested in religion when it comes to conflicts, while we also know that religions are part of different kinds of social action, civil actions, that in some areas, even the religious communities replace the states that are not able to provide welfare, for example. We always see Hezbollah as a jihadi terrorist group. Hezbollah has legitimacy because it provides in the south of Lebanon services that the Lebanese state cannot provide. And it does even serve the Christians in the area. So nobody sees that. You see that that's a kind of multiple facets of religion that we do not take into account. The fact also, and then we have tons of data showing that the most observant practitioners of their tradition are the less violent, or the more eager to criticize violence. And that's the gap here, even in the US. If you look at who is ready to act violently about religion, are not the one who are the most pious in their own tradition. So there is something in there that we have also to look into more in more detail. And the third point is indeed that the beliefs, the doctrine are not the first triggers of political action, either violent or not, and that what is at stake is identification to communities. And that's something that the Western scholarship doesn't address, because we have all been educated in the fact that religion is an individual feature, while most of the significant roles of religion politically have to do with the sense of community. And I think this is something we are missing here in the way we look at religion. In other words, the religion is not a collective of religious individuals. It's something else. It is about the building of not only an identity, but a way to live together. And that's the most important way to look at religion today, or for the next 20 years. I would say.
So, and I'm sure I'm simplifying to a certain degree, Huntington's idea came out of the Clash of Civilizations in 92, 93. Just when scholars were showing its limitations, it was then enshrined in the popular and political imagination. So then you scholars have had to push back against an idea that was already superseded in your own work. So at this point, is a different idea coalescing to take the place of the Clash of Civilizations? Do we have a macro idea of religion in society that can displace that one for the next 20 years, or are we working with lots of different theories that you scholars have to fit together?
It's an interesting question. I think we are, as lots of people, we are the stories we tell. And even in our scholarship, we have deep down ingrained the idea that the secular narrative is the only one that can provide meaning for the collective. And we're going to have to revisit that, because most of the engagement, and I think the pandemic was a moment of that. Religions were important to people, not because they were catering to their spiritual or faith, the enduring use of the term of faith that return to the person, to the intimacy of the belief. This is one aspect. The second aspect is I am part of a community that makes sense. And the nation has provided this meaning for everybody, including religious people. It is about time to revisit the secular narrative, to make room for people who also have a sense of community that is not only based on the nation. And here there is a lot of work to do on the public space. And the fact that not only only the religious voices should be heard, but the role of religion in building this sense of social contract. Without leaning or going to intolerance or excommunication. There are two ways of looking at religions, and you can find example in both, open or closed. So what we are seeing most of the time, and that's the secular narrative, is that religions are closed. There are people in each of these traditions that are trying to open. When are we going to make room for that? I'm not even talking about the politicians who are not even there, but even in the way that we scholars look at religions. That would be my response to you, looking at the open mindset of religious actors, including the religious leaders, but not only. We're talking about women. What happened in the pandemic is that the visibility of women in also building this sense of community, or young people, that would be attractive to lots of the young people that we see now as the nuns, but they are in need of building this community as well. They want to be part of that.
Thank you. What I hear you saying, and I hear some points of contact between your work and Jose's, and that religion is not easily assimilable to the secular narrative. It offers an alternative structure to the structures, to the social imaginaries that dominate so many people's lives, and to actual worldly structures such as those of global governance. But then certain ideas of religion are enshrined within those structures in ways that makes it difficult for us to understand things. Drew has addressed this both in his reflection for the anniversary and in an article he recently wrote for La Civiltà Cattolica. Drew, you suggest that scholars and institutions aren't sufficiently able to grasp a certain distinction that you put forward as very important in Afghanistan and elsewhere, the distinction between urban societies and rural and tribal societies. Has that, 20 years on from 9/11, what is the state of that idea that you consider central to our understanding of things? If I characterize it right.
Yeah, I think you have to characterize it right. I mean, the first point I'd make is that it's an historic pattern. It's not just a recent development. Excuse me if my laryngitis gets the better of me here. But, in the early centuries of Christianity, Christianity in North Africa was affected by divisions between the provincials on the and then the Berbers on one side, and the metropolitan Romans in North Africa on the other. In church history, it's I think pretty well understood that many of the early heresies were social protests by people living on the margins of that kind of world, and that you can see that pattern again and again in the Middle Ages. It's also affected Islam. I mean, the convivencia that could be romanticized in Andalus was an effective place where Christians and Muslims and Jews could live together, but then they were overcome again and again by successive waves of Berbers from North Africa with a more radical religion than the previous wave. And so gradually, before the Spanish monarchy brought them down, they had been greatly weakened by their attacks from their Muslim brothers. So I think we shouldn't be surprised that this pattern reoccurs in our own time. I think that it still exists. I think there's evidence now that just the hints of evidence that the U.S. may be getting, in this case, the government is getting a different perception of this, and that the CIA got the release of Baradar from from jail in Pakistan, and then has been in dialogue with him as the number 2 in Kabul, that there's a sense that, well, you can actually deal with these people to some extent. I still think the fundamental problem exists, and that is that you have tribal warrior cultures on the margins of metropolitan societies that really, you know, when they feel threatened in one way or another, will threaten with violence, and we need to deal with that. I don't think that reaction has to be military. I think Doug Johnston from the Institute for International Religion and International Diplomacy really worked very effectively for a number of years before the surge in Afghanistan with the teachers from the madrasas, and worked with as many as 4,500 madrasa teachers to create some kind of understanding of the West and of non-Muslim society. So I think it can be done, but I think we have to face the reality when there is this level of distance between these tribal societies and our own, that to some extent the reaction has to be policing as well. And I think it's wrong to think of the U.S. as the world's policeman. This has to be international policing, and there the U.S. can do things in terms of logistics and reconnaissance and things, but I think otherwise it should be international with the lead for local people.
So, hearing you set it out the way you just did, I was led to wonder whether framing things the way you frame them actually would serve to reduce the attention to religion, or the responsibility that religion is seen as bearing in global conflict. So should we understand the attack on the World Trade Center as not the attack of Islamic extremists, but as the attack of some tribesmen against a particularly potent symbol of urban life? And should we see the triumph of the Taliban in Afghanistan not as the triumph as a theocratic body, but as the triumph of the rural over the urban, and thus pay less attention to religion and not have religion be so overdetermined in our understanding of these conflicts?
I think there is the third category that Akbar Ahmad gives, which is tribal Islam. I mean, they're combined. You can't sort it out that easily, I think. But I would say that if you look at 9/11, all but one of the hijackers was from one Yemeni tribe, and so there were tribal connections there that were very important that we haven't paid attention to. We've tended to make it look as religious, and not looked enough at the social underpinning of that particular event.
I guess then the question for you, and I get for anybody as we open the things to discussion, is right now the lingua franca of daily journalism is to refer to the divisions in the United States as tribal, and that it's not principled white evangelical Christians versus principled secularists in the cities, but there's a white tribe fighting to hold its territory, and a different tribe that sees the city as territory. I mean, is that kind of facile journalism speak, or does that somehow legitimately derive from the idea that you're putting forward here?
I think there's an analogy. I wouldn't say that it holds firmly, but I think there is somewhat of that same kind of tension between the coastal cities and the hinterlands, and the culture of the hinterlands and the major metropoles. I think that does exist.
Jocelyn?
I would like to bring a caveat here about the use of tribal, because we know that the radical form of Islam were actually shaped by the urban, educated Muslim elite. So I mean, the leadership is not tribal. That's the opposite, actually. What we have seen in Iraq, when the US was there, is that the tribes agreed, the Sunni tribes agreed to work with the General Petraeus at the time against these young people who were coming in there and trying to mobilize them for violence. So I would be careful about using the tribal thing, because the narrative, the leadership is not tribal. Baghdadi was not a tribal member. I mean, so political Islam in its radical form is an urban phenomenon. It's a modern phenomenon. We have to address that. And this modernization that happened in Islam didn't lead to what we know in the West as modernization, but it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. The same thing in the US. I would refrain from using what we are seeing today in terms of religiously based political claim as a tribal claim. This is the voices of people who have gone through failed modernization, or the outcome of modernization has been failure, but that's not tribal, it's the opposite. I mean, it's about the individualization that goes wrong, if I may say so. So that's my claim here, my caveat on, in Afghanistan, the warlord joined the global jihad. There are reasons for that are beyond the discussion we are having now. Yeah.
I think
So-
if you look at the struggles along the 10th parallel from Asia through Africa, that these are very much fostered, when I'm trying to resourced, I suppose, from tribal groups in those regions. Now, it is also the case that they're often fighting against failed elites, who they see as betraying them. I mean, Boko Haram is the classic example of that. Western education is forbidden is a reaction not just to Western education, but to the corruption of the West, or the elites who have Western education. And so I think that we have to deal with the place where the soldiers come from, I think.
Mm-hmm.
When you mentioned the 10th parallel, Drew, I'm reminded of my work on the book. I worked with Eliza Griswold on a book by that title, and one of the themes of the book was that different communities were put in conflict partly by resource scarcity driven by
Right.
climate change. So when we're looking forward to the next 20 years, there's one area in which the past is not a reliable precedent at all, and it's climate change. I think we can agree as members of the center that the response of religion to climate change is going to be a vital part of the next 20 years. Does any of you, and I'll start with Jose if you're willing, have a distinct idea of what form that might take? Because it's something that we really need to know, and that the past doesn't offer a precedent in the way that it does in other areas.
I mean, linking it to the other conversation, rather than tribal or rural urban, I would use center periphery. And it is peripheries that may be within nation states. I mean, the peripheries within the United States. Those are not necessarily rural urban distinctions, although they may be the hinterland. So the center periphery is very important. And of course, we know, and this is an argument which Pope Francis has made, precisely the need to have solidarity with the peripheries. The preferential option for the poor is a way of praising this issue. How do we, at the global level, create structures in which we precisely realize that the greatest threat from climate change comes to the peripheries, geographic peripheries, social peripheries, gender peripheries. So it is precisely the most marginal, the poor, which are going to suffer most from this climate change. And ultimately, out of, if you wish, global self-interest, we will need to transcend our national interests, our class interests, to precisely create these structures of solidarity. And this is historically has been proven that this is the greatest power of religion, to transcend structures already existing and create new bonds of solidarity. And so in this respect, I don't know how it's going to happen, but if it will happen in this form, creating bonds of solidarity between centers and peripheries.
So I hear almost a biblical accent in what you're saying, that let's say the Christian response to climate change is, one, we're all connected. The human family is one. We have obligations to one another that transcend nation and so forth. And two, we have a special obligation to pay attention to what's happening on the periphery, where in this case, the effects of climate change are going to be felt first and most keenly. Is that right?
Yes, but the public health issue of the pandemic has made this even more clearly. If we only attend to the health needs of the centers, we are not going to solve the pandemic, because the periphery is going to constantly recreate the pandemics. So it's a question of in our global structure, we are more and more so interlinked, so intertwined, that the ability to create, if you wish, to extract ourselves from the periphery is problematic. On the other hand, and I think this is also the prophetic voice of Pope Francis. In the old Marxist critique of capitalism, capitalism was bad because it exploited the workers. The problem of today's capitalism is not that it exploits the workers. It is that it is indifferent. It leaves half of the population of the world out of the system. They are not needed. And so they are the discarded. And so we have to create structures so that these discarded people, which the capitalist system will not in any way solve, and national structures will only for the discarded within its own boundaries. In the structure of nations and capitalism, the welfare system was the way of compensating for the inequalities created by the system. We need to create structures at the global level that compensate for the inequalities which the system of capitalism reproduces constantly, and for the different treatment that the geopolitical nation system of states creates. So we can only deal with these inequities, with these inequalities, if we deal with them at the global level.
So when you say that capitalism is indifferent to half the population, my mind goes to Catherine and her work, because historically that half of the population to which capitalism was indifferent was women. Can you envision what role might public religion play, Catherine, in the amelioration of that indifference over the next 20 years to make this half the population not peripheral?
I was happy to hear Jose bring the discussion to the question of inequality, which is the global commitment theoretically is to leave no one behind. The watchwords are inclusion, accepting diversity, but with inclusion and opportunities. And clearly the issues of women have much to do with that, because they affect everyone. In other words, they're not exactly a peripheral group. They're fundamental to every family. So I think it's an interesting challenge where deeply ingrained habits that start when a child is born, and the expectations of what a girl versus a boy will have and will do is deeply ingrained in people's lives. But you have, in contrast, the quite remarkable research and evidence and passionate advocacy that really speaks to empowerment and to equality. And there are some religious traditions that have actually led that transformation, which may be, to my mind, the greatest transformation in social history. The changes in the relationships between men and women, which is something that is still very much underway. There are some religious traditions that have been on the forefront, and there are some that are distinctly uncomfortable with this changing role and both the social practical issues of who's going to cook my meal and who's going to raise my children, but it is also obviously fundamental issues of power. And the issues that you see echoed at the family level are echoed all the way to the global governance structures, whether it's about the inequalities that come with climate change, the inequalities that the COVID crisis has so starkly revealed in lives, including the roles of women and of men.
Thank you. And the way you put it, the extent of the change, when you put it so passionately, I'm a believer. I'm convinced that this is the fundamental change, and I hope that it is the case. A pretty specific question for Jocelyn now from Marjorie Mandelstam Balzer. The question is about the de-radicalization efforts within Islam. How are they going, and how can we understand better than we have to this point the bitter extremism of so many young people in Islam?
Wow, that's more than one question. In a nutshell, the de-radicalization didn't go very well for the reason that I mentioned previously, meaning they took a group of clerics and they asked them to go through some textual analysis with young people who were part of, Al-Qaeda group or other kind of jihadi group. But again, that's the 101 and textual basis that doesn't address the fact that the radical message appeal because of its collective meaning. So people are not get to it, even if they think they do. And that's why we have to be careful and not taking at face value the sort of epiphany that some of these jihadi reports, when they say, I found meaning there. What they found is a group. And the group became something in which they could fit. So when you take this, when you do not, take this into account, no de-radicalization can work. And I think that's part of the meaning. And it's also part of the reason why it has not gone very far. I think the term itself has been discredited, and the engagement of young people in the West toward this radical message is exactly the reason I'm also pointing out here. If I can simplify a lot, it's just that it gives collective meaning. And the less people know about their religion, the more they are attracted to this global narrative that is based on something very narrow and poor. When you look at the Islamic tradition, it is about victimization and retaliation. And this can work a lot for people who live in context where Islam is seen as uncivic, especially in Europe. But that's not the whole tradition. But when you do not know about it, it does appeal. And that's why I've seen lots of the foot soldiers of this jihadi group coming from the West are converts to Islam. And they didn't convert in the traditional way, learning with the sheikh. They converted through this radical narrative. And we know that when people have been educated and have more traditional resources to mobilize, they are less vulnerable to this understanding, or I would say even shaping of what Islam is or should be.
Thank you. The next question I want to point towards Drew. Stephen Meyer observes, well, isn't one person's periphery another's center? And I guess what I've wanted to ask you anyway, Drew, is whether the center and periphery thrust of Francis' pontificate, which Jose spelled out a few minutes ago, has that had, are you seeing practical effects of that outlook for peace building, especially in contrast to Benedict XVI?
That's a very good question. I'd say that Francis has been very consistent in focusing on that kind of program. But it's very hard, I think, the conversion on the part of the more established parts of the church. Much harder to bring along on that kind of agenda. And I think that his goal of synodality, which will be the topic of the next synod, which will go through 2 sessions, is really intended to get the bishops of the world to know one another, as they did to some extent in Vatican II, but to understand that they have a common responsibility that will overcome some of these distances. And the fact that he's appointed so many bishops from the periphery and many fewer from traditional major sees in the Atlantic region, it seems to me suggests he wants to continue that program, but it's really hard. I mean, you can see from the church in the United States, this agenda is not taking hold among many of the bishops. Some of the leading cardinals, yes, but others are very resistant to it. So I don't see it as moving along so well. And I underscore what Jocelyn said. I work with some people who are involved in talking to people interested in ISIS, and they had discovered that ISIS stopped talking to inquirers as soon as they knew something about Islam. They just dropped them, you know. So, but they would talk with kind of disenchanted young people, confused young people, all day long, because they were their target group. These kind of people who didn't fit in, and that was their target group. Mm. But as to the periphery in the church, I think that's going to take a lot of building. I don't think we're there yet. I'm very happy to see that Francis is persistent on his agenda.
I know, just from my layperson's sense of things, that it can be argued that the openings of the Second Vatican Council for a different way of relating among religions have only borne fruit 50 and 60 years later, and these things take time. But if anyone has a distinct vision of what religion's contribution is going to look like 20 years from now, I would love to know it. If Catherine, say on the issue of women, is there a concrete project or approach or initiative that you can imagine where you could say 20 years on, see that this really did happen?
It's an interesting question, because I think many people in the development world, economists, sociologists, anthropologists, historians, have been quite powerfully convinced by some of the evidence that's coming out of both research and experience. And I think in many ways, the religious communities are also amenable to that kind of evidence and persuasion. I think what's been complicated is the disruption that it means to traditional understandings and power relationships. Let's be very clear. This is not about love and harmony and the way things have to be, but it has to do with power and comfort and influence. So, you know, we talk about strategic engagement, which in some ways, you know, we don't want to be unstrategic, which sort of means stupid and maybe scattered, unsystematic. But I think what we are looking for is, and we have faith in the intelligence and the multifaceted approaches that are part of the human condition, so that, yes, I do have faith that the religious communities sometimes slowly and reluctantly, but sometimes even with blinding moments of insight, are moving forward on what, to me, I agree, is such a fundamental issue that benefits people in so many ways. I mean, one of my favorite examples is that a child's head size is related to the level of education of the mother, because intelligent education is so much related to understandings of nutrition and health. So there's so many other examples, but I think that it is fundamental, but it is also a profound change in the way people relate from the time they wake up until the time they go to sleep.
We're over time, and so I'm going to let that be the last word. The fact that you have hope that religious institutions have a significant contribution to make for the next 20 years. And let's hope that if we're doing an anniversary event down the road, it's not marking a terrorist attack, but a significant positive achievement in which religion played a role. Thank you so much, Catherine Marshall, Jose Casanova, Jocelyn Cesare, Father Drew Christensen. Thanks again to Tom Banshoff, the director of the center. And thanks to all of you who have joined this event. It's been a real privilege to lead the conversation with and for all of you. Thank you very much and have a great day.